I now ask for your careful attention as Brother Ian comes forward to lead us in his first address on the study of Absalom. Brother Ian, please.
Thank you, Brother Matthew. Good afternoon, brothers and sisters and young people. It's great to be with all of you, and we'd like to welcome all those that are joining us by way of the Zoom today as well. Aunt Judy and I are very happy to be with all of you. We love it up here, especially in the fall. It's nothing nicer than Manitoulin in the fall. Well, we're going to start our study of Absalom. You think to yourself, well, what can I learn from the life of Absalom? Well, what's really interesting in the scriptures is that the only person that receives more attention of David's children than Absalom is Solomon himself. That's how much Absalom is going to dominate the record in the scriptures for us. He's going to enter the scriptures in 2 Samuel chapter 13, and he's actually going to stay with us for 8 chapters until 2 Samuel chapter 20. That's how much he's recorded in the record for us. In fact, the rebellious spirit that Absalom unleashes is actually going to plague David and his family right to the time of Solomon and even beyond the time of Solomon, as we'll see. And the story of Absalom, it's an epic tragedy. You sometimes think to yourself, well, what can I learn from such a negative example in the scriptures? Well, I guess one thing we could learn is we won't be like that boy, or we shouldn't act like Absalom. That's maybe some of the lessons that we might learn, but hopefully there's a few other things that we're going to pick up from the life of Absalom as well. It's a story that I think really has a lot of lessons and warnings for us today. And condensed within these 8 chapters is examples of politics at its worst. And we think we have politics bad today. Well, you should see the politics back that we're going to read about in the time of King David. There's the whole history of all that's wrapped up with David and his family. It's a story of rivalry, of rape, of lust, of hatred, of murder, of rebellion, and even open warfare. And that's just David's family. It's incredible that this is in the record. And in order to kind of grasp the scale of Absalom's life, what we've done is we've broken it down into 4 parts. So the first thing that we'd like to look at here is the first thing that we've entitled our first class. And if we can click to it. If not, there we go. We'll try this. Is we've entitled this first session, The Son of Maacah, A House Divided. And what we want to do in this first class together is we want to look at David's family dynamic. All the events that surrounding and David's sin with Bathsheba and really what that really set forward in his family. And this is where we'll also get our initial introduction in this first session to Absalom, the son of a foreign princess. And that's what he was. The second session we've entitled The Heart of the King, the exiled son returns. And here we want to look at Absalom's first grab for the kingdom and the repercussions that came from that, as well as his eventual return from the land of Geshur. In the third class, we want to look at the stealer of hearts, the art of rebellion. And in that session, we want to examine Absalom's plot to take the kingdom. And it really resulted in the greatest threat that David ever faced in his role as the king. And we're going to see how Absalom embarks on a mission and how he goes about to try to steal the hearts of the nation of Israel. It's a very ingenious plan. And then finally, in our fourth session, which we'll do in the Sunday school class tomorrow, we're going to look at what we've called Absalom's place, the way of all men. We want to look at Absalom's revolt, and we're going to consider what he was trying to achieve in his life, and we're going to look at the startling end of his life and what that can teach us. So that's how we've divided it up. Well, again, in the first session, next to David and Joab, Absalom dominates the record in 2 Samuel. This is a word cloud, and this word cloud shows all of the names within the record of Samuel here, 2 Samuel, and you can see the large names are the ones that dominate the record the most. So we've really got David dominating, the word king is a dominant, the word Lord is dominant, Joab, and yet look at the prominence that Absalom has within the whole book of 2 Samuel. He's a looming character. God wants us to learn something from this young man. Absalom was really loved by David. So just remember this as we go through this character of Absalom. David loved this boy. There's something that drew him to him. He generated almost a blinding love in his father. That's how much David really loved him. And David loved him so much, he was prepared to overlook a lot of the boy's faults. A lot of his son's faults he overlooked because he loved him. And he was also a man that was watched and greatly admired by Israel. That's why he's described in the biblical record as a heart stealer, because he slowly and methodically plotted the overthrow of his father, King David. And this is the man that we hope to get to know over this weekend, God willing. What a towering character he is, a seemingly perfect politician, an ideal king that really any nation would love to have. Well, let's start at the beginning. The house of Saul passes off the scene, and the kingdom of David begins. And I don't know about you, but when I sometimes go through my Bible readings, I get very confused at all the different sons and that David had and which wife was connected. So I put this little bit of a slide together. You might find it helpful if you put it in your margin. I don't know how you tend to do. I tend to think in pictures, but I found it very helpful in my margin just to be able to kind of figure out who's who and where they came from. So this is in 2 Samuel 3, verses 2 to 5. And we read here of the birth of David's sons. Now, these were born to him in Hebron. And so we read in verse 2 of 2 Samuel chapter 3, and unto David were sons born in Hebron. And the firstborn was, and this is the name we're going to remember, Amnon. He's the firstborn of Ahinoam the Jezreelitess. And verse 3 tells us of 2 Samuel 3, and his second was Chileab of Abigail, the wife of Nabal the Carmelite. And the third, Absalom, the son of Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. And the fourth, Adonijah, the son of Haggith. And the fifth, Shephatiah, the son of Abital. And the sixth, Ithream, by Eglah, David's wife. These were born to David in Hebron. And so we have all of those listed here as the ones that are born in this area here of Hebron. These children, which we're going to call the Hebron children, were born during the 7.5 years that David began his rule from the city of Hebron. All his other children are going to be born to him in Jerusalem, where he would reign for another 33 years. And that's in 1 Chronicles chapter 3, verses 1 to 4. So David, beginning at the age of 33, has 6 sons by 6 different wives while living in Hebron. And then we read in 1 Chronicles chapter 3 and verses 1 to 9, it's going to record here the details about David's family. These are the Hebron children and their births. They're found in the first 4 verses. And we want to just briefly look at this in the record as it helps, I think, to help us maybe understand Absalom and also to understand the tensions and the rivalries that were taking place within this family dynamic. It's not recorded here in 1 Chronicles 3 about David's first wife, but we know that his first wife was, who was his first wife? Any of the younger ones know who his first wife was? Who was David's first wife? They were really good last night at CYC, I'll tell you. They had all the, well, I was giving away chocolates last night. It was Michal, right? It was Michal. And we know that from 1 Samuel 18 and verse 27, Saul's daughter. She would what does she bring to the family? Well, she was certainly brought a lot of bitterness, we know. She brought a lack of spirituality towards David's house. Even Saul thought she would be trouble for David, so I think I'll give her to David. She was forcefully separated from her husband, Phaltiel, a man that Saul had wrongly given to her husband after David had fled from Saul. And David would later bring Michal back to himself after the death of Saul. And she would be childless for the rest of her life. And so she brought a lot of bitterness and a lack of spirituality to David's family. And then we have Ahinoam, David's second wife, and from the record, she's the first to have a child with David, and that's the boy Amnon. So Amnon then becomes heir to the throne. He's the firstborn. And Amnon, as we know, he turns out to be someone who chooses wrong friends, we're going to find from the record. He's a liar, and he treats his sister terribly. Then we find Abigail has David's second son named Chileab. And that's in 1 Chronicles 3, verse 1. And we're not sure what becomes of him as he seems to pass off the scene. In fact, it's possible he died when he was very young. It seems that also that David marries Abigail either shortly after he marries Ahinoam or very nearly at the same time. And then, of course, we have Maacah. Her name means oppression. And from her, David has his third son, Absalom, and his sister Tamar. Two very beautiful looking people, the Bible says. Maacah is herself, she's a king's daughter, making her a princess. So that's Princess Maacah, that's Absalom's mom. And we'll have a bit more to say about her in a minute. And then we've got Haggith. And Haggith bears David's fourth son, Adonijah. Now Adonijah, he's a fella. He's going to grow up, and he's going to be a plotting fellow, and he's going to wait the right time to take the throne, just like Absalom does. He's a bad boy as well. And when David is old and weak, Adonijah is going to strike, and he's going to try to take the kingdom. So David has to rise up, and he has to anoint Solomon to put an end to Adonijah's blatant grab for the throne. That's the kind of boy he is. And even more remarkable, in 1 Kings chapter 2, he tries to plot with Bathsheba to get Solomon's permission so he can marry Abishag. You remember that? He tries to marry Abishag, who ministered to David. So there's another way that Adonijah tried to take the throne. And Solomon says, "What are you doing? You're plotting to take the throne. You're trying to take Abishag, who ministered to David, as if you're going to be the next king." And of course, he then has to deal with that boy because he was so wicked and tried to take the throne from Solomon. So this is a boy that also badly wants the kingdom. And then Abital has David's fifth son, Shephatiah. Eglah gives birth to David's sixth son in Hebron, and his name was Ithream. And then we have David's Jerusalem's children, and they're listed in 1 Chronicles chapter 3, verses 5 to 9. So as we know, David reigns here for 33 years with all the sons that he had from Hebron, and he now has his Jerusalem children. So in Jerusalem, he has more children, and he takes another wife. And here's where he has Bathsheba. And she has 4 children. She has Shimei, or his name is Shammah, or Shobab, Nathan, and Solomon. And then there's other sons that came along, and we're going to call them the 9, because we don't even know who their mothers are. We're not given the names of some of their mothers. But he has another 9 children. So the point that we're trying to get out of this is what a family dynamic. Multiple wives, multiple complications, at least 8 wives that are named, with multiple sons, 19 sons that are named, and 1 daughter, Tamar, plus 10 concubines. You can imagine each mom looking out for their son. Maybe he could be the next king. Each of these boys all being princes, and each mom trying to say, maybe he could be next. You can imagine the rivalry within that family. Each mother, they all came from different backgrounds. Abigail, we know, came from a very abusive, self-centered, perhaps even an alcoholic husband. We know Nabal, who the Bible describes as a fool. Nevertheless, in the record, she was a wonderful woman and very wise. Perhaps it was Abigail who provided a stable hand in David's family for all the other chaos that was happening with the different rivalries. And as we talked about, Michal, the daughter of Saul, lacked any spiritual understanding. And think about the troubles that she would have brought to that family as well. And then we have Maacah. Maacah, the mother of Absalom and Tamar, David's only foreign wife, a woman with a very worldly background. She was schooled in the religion of Geshur. As the daughter of King Talmai, that's who her father was, she would no doubt have been a very strategic marriage for David, giving him peace on his northern border region. The kingdom of Geshur is actually felt to have occupied the area just northeast of the Sea of Galilee. Today we would know that area probably as the Golan Heights, and that's where this area of Geshur has. In fact, archaeologists who have done work in that particular region of the world tell us that their religion was that of a bull. It was the moon god, the bull. And so Israel, we know, in the days of Joshua, tried to conquer that area for the tribe of Manasseh, but they couldn't do it. The Geshurites were very strong. They were unsuccessful, and they couldn't take that part for Manasseh. And we also know that Absalom, he felt a kinship towards that area, because after he is going to kill his brother, the first place he flees to Geshur. He knows that he can find safety with his grandfather, the king of Geshur. So the family ties that his mother had with that region and to their father, King Talmai, gave Absalom a sense that he was going to be protected there. Perhaps with kindred spirits who would love to see the throne of David overturned and a grandson of King Talmai, a Geshurite, take the kingdom of Israel. They would have loved to see that. So Princess Maacah also had something that none of the other wives or concubines had. She may not have had the firstborn son, that belonged to Ahinoam, but she had the most beautiful son. In fact, in 2 Samuel 14, in verse 25, we are told that Absalom had no blemish. He was like perfect. And no doubt those features were probably attributed to Maacah, and we know they were certainly attributed to David, because in 1 Samuel 16 in verse 12, and I'll read from the net here, 1 Samuel 16 verse 12, so Jesse had him brought in, so this is, remember when they were going to anoint these, looking for the sons of Jesse. Now he was, before Samuel, now he was ruddy with attractive eyes and a handsome appearance. And the Lord said, go and anoint him. This is the one. So those are the characteristics that David had. And Absalom had natural features that attracted people to him. Something that I can't relate to. They say, people that have amazing good looks, sometimes people are drawn to those type of people. And sometimes they can even attract the wrong crowds for the wrong reasons. And perhaps sometimes people that are so good looking, again, something I can't relate to, they maybe get puffed up. They are puffed up. People tell them constantly, you're so good looking, you're so beautiful, you're so handsome, and they get puffed up. And in some ways then this can become a curse rather than a blessing. And it certainly was, as we're going to find in the life of Absalom. Well, all of these factors combined to make Absalom the man he was. Yet there was one more important event that really made Absalom the way he was. And it's going to impact his life, and it's going to shape his life, but not in a good way. And it had to do with the actions of his father David, which we had read about in our opening reading. You know, there's an expression, like father, like son. Now, that's not always true. To be fair, that's not always a truism. But in the case of Absalom, what he saw his father do, he then thought, if my dad David can do that, why can't I do that? If I want something bad enough, why can't I do what my father did and take it and seize it, even the kingdom? He had either watched it or he had been told by others all that had transpired with his father's sin with Bathsheba. How David saw something that he greatly desired, something that was not his but another man's. But as a king, you can desire and you can have, and murder can be a way of achieving it if that's what's necessary. That's what he would have learned. It's not just Absalom. All David's wives and his children would have known what was done. All Israel knew what David did. And as a consequence for that sin that David committed in secret with Bathsheba, God pronounced on David through Nathan the sentence that was going to cause tremendous turmoil and upheaval in his family. A rupture in the family so great that David's going to lose 4 of his sons, 3 of them to violent deaths. That's the price that he's going to pay for what happened. For the sin that David thought was done in secret, here is the Lord's judgment. So we'll read on this left-hand side of the screen here, we have 2 Samuel 12, verses 10 and 11. And we read, "Now therefore, because David, you did this evil with Bathsheba, the sword shall never depart from thine house, because thou hast despised me and hast taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be thy wife. Thus saith the Lord, behold, I will raise up evil against thee out of thine own house, and I will take thy wives before thine eyes, and give them unto thy neighbor, and he shall lie with thy wives in the sight of this son." Now that word neighbor there in the Hebrew means friend or companion. So the punishment that God decreed on David demonstrated that God is righteous, even though he was going to forgive David. Justice was performed by God. His righteousness was declared, and the incredible faith of David led David to confess the words in the very next verse of 2 Samuel 12, and at verse 12, "I have sinned against Yahweh." That's the kind of man David was. So we're going to talk a number of negative things about David, but never forget, he was a man after God's own heart. David had tremendous character qualities. And David immediately recognized, I've sinned against God. That's the kind of man he was. But nevertheless, for the sin that he committed, there's going to be consequences. Consequences would follow for the sin that he committed. Well, what can we learn from this, brothers and sisters and young people? What are some of the lessons that we can learn from this sin of King David? Well, the first thing we learn is what we do affects others. It can affect our family. It can affect the Ecclesia. And note too, the sin of adultery was against God. God did not make David's sons do the evil that they did, nor were they held accountable for what David did. They were responsible for their own actions. But what God does show David is that by his sin, he gave license for others to follow. And God would allow that evil to manifest itself in his house. So that's the first lesson I think that we get from this. What we do affects others. What about a second one? Well, I think the other thing that we learn is God is involved in the punishment. Such was the faith of David that he saw God's involvement as a good thing because he viewed God as a merciful God. We may be forgiven. We will be forgiven if we go to God in sincerity, in prayer. We know that we will be forgiven. But the consequences remain because God is right in condemning sin. What about the third thing that we can take away from this? Well, we learn we're not immune to what happens to others. Never think that can't possibly happen to me or to my family. David would experience what he witnessed happen to others. You recall back in 1 Samuel chapter 15 when Saul disobeyed God, that Samuel came to Saul and he said to Saul, this is 1 Samuel 15 verse 28, "The Lord hath rent the kingdom of Israel, Saul, because you did this wickedness, from thee this day, and hath given it thee to a neighbor of thine that is better than thou." And those words, that word neighbor, haunted Saul for the rest of his life. And those words, David would now come ringing back into his ears. His friend, his companion, his neighbor, it's going to be his son, is going to do these things right in front of his very eyes. And that's exactly when Saul realized a neighbor is going to take the throne from me. And he watched David like a hawk after that. And it bothered him for the rest of his life. And it's now coming back to haunt David for the wickedness that he did with Bathsheba. This punishment for the sin that David committed doesn't take long to go into effect. The first offspring to experience the consequence of David's sin was the son that was born to Bathsheba and David. The child died, and David and Bathsheba suffered the consequence for their sin with the loss of their firstborn. And this pattern of David's sin that Nathan calls the doing of evil is going to repeat itself. And so we read that with David, there's a pattern to this doing of evil. David thought that what he could do in secret. So that's the first thing you learn about this doing of evil. He thought he could do it in secret. And he's going to find that 3 of his boys are going to do the exact same thing as David's done. Imagine that. 3 of his sons are going to follow the method that David did when he did evil with Bathsheba. So the first thing we read is he does it in secrecy. Sin likes darkness. It doesn't like people to see that we're doing wrong. It happens out of sight. And it gives the false sense that we can get away with sin. Even God has not seen it. This is what David thought in 2 Samuel 12 and verse 12. He did it in secret. The second thing is, it has to do with sight. The unchecked desires arise from the lusting of the eyes. David saw Bathsheba, and he wanted her. So his sight, the lust of the eyes took place. And that's verse 2 of 2 Samuel 11. And we put the corresponding verses beside each of the records here. The third thing is he sent. In order for sin to take place, you've got to do a movement. You've got to make it happen. And so he did. He sent. The opportunity for sin is then created. And he sent and had Bathsheba brought to himself. And Bathsheba had to obey the king. The next thing we see is that sin takes place. The desire is fulfilled. The taking or doing of what is desired is now accomplished. And that's in 2 Samuel 11, verses 4, verse 15, and verse 17. So there's a pattern that's followed here. And then the next part of the pattern is there's a suspension. Now, what do we mean by suspension? Well, since justice or Judge David wasn't struck dead by God with a bolt of lightning for doing the bad that he did with Bathsheba, he actually thought he got away with it. There is a sense that you can get away with sin. And that's what we get from 2 Samuel 11, verse 27. David actually thought he could get away with it. There's a suspension. But we know God sees everything. And God will do it in his time. And then finally, the time is up when God does take action. And that's the suffering. And we find that in 2 Samuel 12, verses 9 to 12. Ultimately, the consequences for his sinful actions are realized. In the case of David, it was heartache and pain and a family divided. For the other boys, it was the violent deaths that they're going to suffer. And the same pattern is going to repeat itself in David's oldest boy, Amnon. It's the exact same pattern is going to happen again. And so we have down in here in 2 Samuel 12, verse 9, wherefore hast thou despised the commandment of the Lord to do evil in his sight? David, all your boys are going to follow. They're going to do the exact same thing. And so it is with Amnon. We're going to see from the story of Amnon, he does the exact same thing. He does something in secret. He does something with, he looks with his eyes. He sends to make it happen. He does the sin. He thinks he gets away with the sin. And then finally he suffers for his sin. So that's going to repeat itself again and again. And brothers and sisters, that actually happens again with Absalom and Adonijah. The exact same pattern. And we call this pattern really the doing of evil, as it's described to us in 2 Samuel 12 and verse 9. Well, we know that that's the pattern that sin follows. We find that from the record of James, chapter 1 and verse 15. And we have that verse on the screen for us. It says in James 1 verse 15, then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin. And sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. And so there's this pattern that happens with the doing of evil. It follows a set pattern. We have the idea of secrecy. It's as if something is hidden. Then we have the idea of sight with the lust of the eyes. And then we have the making the opportunity for sin, sending for it. Then we have the sin itself or committing the act itself. And then we have a suspension. No, God didn't judge me for it. I wasn't hit with a bolt of lightning. I got away with it. And then finally we have the suffering. We bear the consequence for our sins. And bearing the consequences are unavoidable. And look at the way that Absalom is introduced to the scene. This is the first time in the scriptures that we're introduced to Absalom. And how are we introduced to Absalom? Well, we're introduced to Absalom in connection with his brother Amnon. That's how he's introduced to us in the records. So right after the record of David's sin with Bathsheba, which by the way would have taken at least a year in time, so the fair bit of time would have taken place between the events of chapter 12 and the start of 2 Samuel 13. And nevertheless, look what we read in 2 Samuel 13 and verse 1. So if you have your Bibles open to 2 Samuel 13 and verse 1, we'll just follow the record for a little bit here. You notice that the very first thing that verse 1 says, it says, and it came to pass after this. After what? After David's sin with Bathsheba. So even though that was a period of perhaps maybe a year, the biblical record wants us to see chapter 13, the events there, connected with David's sin. It came to pass after this. What about it? That Absalom, the son of David, had a fair sister. It's not even about Absalom, but the record wants us to see a connection with Absalom. This is actually about Tamar. And it's not Tamar is not introduced as David's daughter. She's introduced to us as Absalom's sister. Incredible, eh? So the record is really wanting us to connect this sin with Absalom. That's what we're supposed to get from this, I think. And that's why there's this connection. And so we see here this idea of that Absalom, the son of David, had a fair sister whose name was Tamar, and Amnon, the son of David, loved her. And here's what we read about Amnon's lust for his half-sister Tamar, who was Absalom's sister. So in verse 1, it came to pass after this that Absalom, the son of David, had a fair sister whose name was Tamar, and Amnon, the son of David, loved her. Verse 2, and Amnon was so vexed that he fell sick for his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin, and Amnon thought it hard for him to do anything to her. So as we say, Tamar is not even described as David's daughter, but she's described as Absalom's sister. And we see this emphasized again in verse 4. In verse 4 it says, and Amnon said unto her, I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister. So Amnon knows that he can't have what he wants. And he makes himself sick over it. Such was the lust that he had towards Tamar. But wouldn't you know it, Amnon has a friend. And his friend's name is Jonadab. And that's David's nephew. And he was a snake of a man. He was not the kind of friend that you want. He was a snake of a man. Verse 3, Jonadab was a snake. Well, she doesn't say it. It says Jonadab was a very subtle man. And he hatches a plan for Amnon to get what he wanted. All Amnon has to do is lie to his father David to fake that he's sick, and then David will agree for your sister to come and look after you. Send for your sister to come to you like David had his servants summon Bathsheba. Just do the same thing. Well, the plan works. Jonadab's plan was a good plan. He's a bad man. But he had a plan. And David, thinking Amnon is sick, does as he requests. And he sends Tamar, listen, Tamar, go and look after your brother. He's very sick. So the record wants us to see the sin for what it is. Look at the emphasis that's placed on Amnon's family relationship with Tamar. Verse 5, Jonadab tells Amnon to say, my sister Tamar. Verse 6, let my sister Tamar come. Verse 7, David tells Tamar to go get her brother Amnon's, to go to her brother Amnon's house. Verse 8, so Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house. Verse 10, she brought the cake she made to Amnon, her brother. Verse 11, Amnon says, come lie with me, my sister. Verse 12, and Tamar rightly answers, no, my brother. So the biblical record wants us to see that Amnon is warned constantly, she is your sister, you are not allowed to take her. She is not yours. And he has been told and warned again and again and again. Stop and think about what you're doing. Sometimes in the mercy of God, before we do a sin, we're warned not to do the sin. And Amnon was warned repeatedly. This was not right, what he was thinking of doing. And it's interesting because in 2 Samuel 11, verse 3, David was told before he sinned with Bathsheba that she was Uriah's wife. So David was given a warning before he committed the sin that he did. Such is the mercy of our God. Well, Tamar pleads with Amnon. Such wickedness, she says, Amnon, should not be done in Israel. And you really feel for this young girl that's caught up in this ugly situation. But Amnon couldn't be reasoned with it. His lust had so filled his mind, he would not be dissuaded from what he wanted to do. And so in verse 14, we read, howbeit he would not listen to her voice. He was stronger than her. He forced her, and he lay with her. And what happens to poor Tamar? Well, Tamar is then, she's put outside his room by his servant, and the door is bolted after her. And she goes away in great sorrow and anguish. She put ashes on her head. She rends the royal garment that a princess would wear. And we know from the record that it says that Amnon hated her with the same lust that he originally had towards her. Such was that wickedness of that man. He treated his sister so terribly. And so she comes out and she meets Absalom. Well, what's Absalom going to do? This is the first record that we have of Absalom. What's Absalom like? What's he going to be like? Well, the first thing that Absalom does, he instantly suspects his brother Amnon. So Absalom is no dummy. He instantly suspects, what is Amnon, my brother, done to you? Verse 20, and Absalom, her brother, says to her, now we want to pay attention to this because the first time this Absalom ever speaks. What's Absalom say? Well, he says, hath Amnon thy brother been with thee? But hold now thy peace, my sister. He is thy brother. Regard not this thing. So Tamar remained desolate. It means to be astonished. Jusinius tells us it means to be put in silence in her brother's Absalom's house. What a strange thing to say. We know he has affection for her. We know Absalom has affection for his sister Tamar because he's going to name his own daughter after her. But he seems void of any empathy. The very first words are recorded of Absalom. He's got absolutely no empathy to what his sister just went through. In fact, in the net version for verse 20, it reads this way. Her brother Absalom said to her, was Amnon your brother with you? Now be quiet, my sister. He is your brother. Don't take it too seriously. So the terrible thing that happened to her, he says, don't take it too seriously. You can live in my house. That was the kind of man that Absalom was. He completely lacked any empathy for what this poor girl had just gone through. Tamar, she's now shamed. She's devastated after being treated with such contempt. And she now has to live in the house of her brother Absalom. Well, what happens when David learns of this? What is David going to do when he hears how Amnon tricked him and did this terrible thing to his sister? Surely David's going to do something. And so we see in verse 21 that David was very wroth. He was very upset about things. He was very angry. What did he do? He didn't do anything. He loved that boy. He didn't take any action. And here's now where I think we start to see the sin with Bathsheba is affecting David's ability to judge. David sees what Amnon did as perhaps not that far away from what he did by taking another man's wife, when he took something that he shouldn't have. And David would have reflected on the mercy of God. God forgave me. Whatever the motivation, the result is that David does nothing. And so we find that David's hesitation and inaction after Amnon's wickedness towards Tamar is going to be a fatal mistake. That's going to prove to be a fatal mistake on the part of David. And so we read in Ecclesiastes 8 and verse 11. This is a very, very interesting verse. Again, it's all part of this idea that we think we can get away with things. So in Ecclesiastes 8 and verse 11, we read, because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the hearts of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. And we know that's what it's like with our own children. If they do something and we let them get away with it, they think they got away with it. They can do it again if we don't take action quickly. And so it is. God says, if the judgment is delayed, sometimes people think they can just keep doing it. They can just keep doing that evil. And that's certainly what happened with the house of David. The whole kingdom watched. Adonijah watched. Ahithophel watched. Joab watched. Absalom watched. And no justice took place. David didn't do anything. Amnon doesn't even flee anywhere. He becomes emboldened. In a sense, he got away with it. And brothers and sisters, and young people, sometimes we too can feel that we can get away with things. We might start to think that we get away with sins that we commit. Well, it's the same type of thinking that Amnon and later Absalom and later Adonijah are going to display. And the Lord Jesus Christ himself warns us. He says, don't be like that. As my disciples, don't be like that. And so in Matthew 24 and at verse 48, and it's a real warning for us because we're living in the last days before Christ returns. Jesus says, in the last days, he says, but and if that evil servant shall say in his heart, so I'm in Matthew 24, and I'm at verse 48, but if that evil servant says in his heart, my Lord delayeth his coming, and shall begin to smite his fellow servants, and to eat and drink with the drunken, the Lord of that servant will come in a day when he looketh not for him, and in an hour when he is not aware of, and shall cut him asunder and appoint his portion with the hypocrites. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So if we allow the attitude of mind to set in that our Lord is delayed in coming, he's a long way off, and events just keep going the way it is, the world just keeps moving like it is, our behavior changes. Justice and judgment need to be key parts of our family life. And we can see that in our own children. Sometimes our child does something wrong and we don't take action. Or the action we take may be not equal to the crime or the offense that was committed by our child. Sometimes we might even ignore what they do. We might make excuses for it. We might laugh it off and throw up our hands. What can I do? Well, what should David have done? Well, under the law, in Leviticus 20, in verse 17, it says that if a boy does that, he should be put away. That was such evil that he was to be removed out of Israel. Such was the wickedness that he did, and that's found in Leviticus. So if David knew his Bible, if he had read Leviticus 20, he would have seen what he should have done with that boy. Well, we've seen, brothers and sisters and young people, that David has had multiple marriages. He's been away a lot. He was fighting a lot of battles. He was very preoccupied in looking after the things of the kingdom. But most of all, his egregious sin with Bathsheba all contributed to his house being very divided. And so in Luke 11, verse 17, the Lord says, but he, knowing their thoughts, said unto them, every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation, and an house divided against a house falleth. So David's kingdom was in turmoil. Again, think about it. This doesn't happen to a house that's united. This happens to a house that's divided. And it starts to fall apart because it fights within itself. And so David's kingdom, he's in big trouble. He's got a lot of turmoil in his house. He has a house that's divided. So what can we then take away very quickly from this first session? Well, the first thing we want to take away with is when we go against God's commandments, we need to understand clearly we are actually going against God himself. Nathan twice reminded David of this fact, that his sin was against God. So never let us forget that. The second thing I think we can take away from this first session is what we do affects not only ourselves, our family, but it affects the Ecclesia's family as well, because we bear the name of Christ. And as parents, we bear a massive responsibility to set a good example. David's sin with Bathsheba resulted in untold grief for himself and for his family for years to come. His actions provided the excuses for his sons to do the same thing. I think a third thing we can take away is if we do not take action against wrong or evil, it can spread and it can develop into an attitude of mind both for ourselves and those around us that, hey, I can get away with this. So David's inability to take the necessary action for Amnon's rape of his sister Tamar resulted in the attitude of mind in Absalom that he could get away with an evil deed. And so Absalom prepares a plan so bold that with one blow he could claim the kingdom for himself. But things don't go exactly as planned. And God willing, that'll be the subject for our next class.